a good paper necessarily looks like. So don't try and guess it. And don't ask me whether this or that is a good topic. Anything is a good topic. And I don't want to be put in the position of vetting your choice. Any questions, any observations about the final assignment? It's obviously not a research paper. It's a thought paper. Develop an argument with a beginning, a middle, and an end. You can do whatever research you like, using the materials of the course or any other readings. So you choose. Any questions? Any doubts? Okay. So we have 5 more classes, with this one included. In the earlier part of the course, I dealt with the relation between the vanguard, the productive vanguard of the economy, and the rest. In this class, I will deal with the relation between finance and production, or finance and the real economy. And next week, with the relation between labor and capital. After dealing with the relation between the vanguard and the rest, I interrupted the course of the argument to address 2 general issues, institutions and inequality. And now we're back to the sequence. The week after next, we address globalization. From the same standpoint that has animated the argument thus far. The central assumption there in that argument is that we don't have to choose between more globalization and less globalization. We can and should ask which globalization. So just as the market order has no single natural and necessary form, so too globalization has no singular, natural, and necessary form. And the character of globalization, the form that it does take, of course, expands or restricts the space for natural experiments. And our interest is that it expand the space rather than restrict it. In the second to the last class, we go back to the background theme of the course, the alternative futures of economics, understood broadly not just as the economics that exists, but as the economics that we could create. And finally, I'll reserve the final class, the last class, for your questions. I hope inspired by your paper topics, and whatever themes you want to bring to our discussion. Now, finance and the real economy. The premise of the programmatic part of the argument thus far has been that there is no singular, natural, and necessary form of the market order. And it's that same premise, then, that informs what I have to say about finance and the real economy. In the orthodox approach to finance and to its relation to the real economy or to production, the dominant view is that if there is some problem in the organization of finance or in access to finance, it must be because there is some localized defect of competition or symmetrical information in the financial markets. If there is such a defect, the proper response is to fix it by perfecting competition, understood in the broad sense to include overcoming asymmetries of information. And in the meantime, until we can fix the localized competitive flaw, the orthodoxy recommends that there be an equally localized regulatory response to the localized defect in competition. Now, what is the most important idea that this orthodox approach excludes? What it excludes is the notion that different ways of organizing finance and of shaping its relation to the real economy, to production, might either tighten or loosen the relation, the service that finance renders to production, to the real economy. And this thesis is absolutely crucial to all of the arguments that I now intend to begin. Different ways of organizing finance and of shaping its relation to the real economy can either tighten or loosen the link of finance to production. The best way to make finance less dangerous, on this view, is to make it more useful. And to make it more useful, we have to assure that financial deepening prevails over financial hypertrophy. Financial hypertrophy is the growth of finance regardless of its usefulness to production. If finance becomes hypertrophic, it devours not just an increasing part of profit in the economy, but also an increasing part of talent in the society. The contrast to financial hypertrophy is financial deepening. Finance enlisted in the service of production, of the real economy. And it's this idea, the idea that different arrangements can enlist finance more effectively in the service of production, or remove it from the service of production, that the orthodoxy excludes. Now, early in the course, I brought up a simple example from early American history of this phenomenon in finance. I described the political economy of the early republic of the United States in the period from independence to the Civil War. And I said then that there were two great focal points of institutional reconstruction. On top, there was the Hamiltonian project of national development, of nation building, with massive mobilization of physical, financial, technical, and human resources. But the country would not have become what it became if this project, on top of nationalist development, did not interact with the selective democratization of what were then the two most important sectors of the American economy, agriculture and finance. And with respect to finance, the form that this selective democratization took was the dissolution of the Second National Bank of the United States under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and the subsequent development in the country of the most decentralized system of local banks at the disposal of the local producer, not just the local consumer, that the world had ever seen. So the populist party, so to speak, the opponents of the incipient financial plutocracy, were willing to deprive themselves of the benefits of the national bank as an instrument of development in order to deny the financial plutocracy the fundamental instrument by which it was acquiring control over the American economy, which was the national bank. For over 100 years, any bank was forbidden to operate in more than one state of the Union, until at the end of the 19th century, the New York banks became de facto national banks in the era of J.P. Morgan, even before the legal prohibition was lifted. And this coerced decentralization was a simple form of the attempt not only to deepen the relation of finance to production, but also to democratize it. To democratize it by making credit capital accessible to a much wider range of economic agents. So now we can add another contrast, or another duo of concepts. Deepening, which I just contrasted with hypertrophy, and democratization. There can be deepening without democratization, but it seems that there cannot be democratization without deepening. Any democratization of access to capital seems to require some form of what I just called deepening. And the relation between democratization and deepening is evident in this early American experiment. Now, if we look at a developed economy today, take the American economy, the United States economy, we can see that there are three different worlds in which finance connects or fails to connect with production. First, there is the world of the large, established, successful firms, some of which now hold vast pools of liquid capital. Now, how do they relate to the capital markets? They rarely go to the capital markets to borrow money. They're more likely to go to the capital markets as financiers than as producers, to make financial gains, to take themselves private, to take initiatives that benefit their managers. That's a world in which, for the most part, finance seems to do very little for production, but often a great deal for the profits or interests of those who control these corporations. The second world is the world of small family business, traditionally based on family saving and self-exploitation. They do use the banking system occasionally, but we can see that quantitatively in a very limited dimension. And we can see that because studying the lending portfolio of the banks, including the local banks in the United States, we can see that the amount of mortgage, credit card, and consumer lending vastly exceeds all lending to producers. And then there's the third world, which is the world in which finance interacts with the startup, disruptive enterprises. That is, of these three worlds, the one in which finance has the closest relation to production. The startup enterprises specialize not in efficiency improving innovations that are also characteristically capital sparing, but in disruptive innovations that are capital intensive. That's the one world in which finance is deeply engaged with the real economy. But the overall dimension, the quantitative magnitude, is very limited. Now, in finance theory, the finance theory that is dependent on the orthodoxy that I characterized a moment ago, there are a number of views that cast a halo of naturalness on this circumstance that I just described. For example, there is the so-called pecking order theory of corporate finance. According to this pecking order theory, in principle, internal finance, meaning finance on the basis of the retained earnings of the firm, is preferable to external finance. And in external finance, debt is preferable to equity as a basis of finance. So the order is internal finance, then debt, then equity. But it is a common observation made by the students of the capital markets that with respect to entrepreneurial or innovative firms, this order, this pecking order, is commonly inverted. With respect to those innovative firms, the equity comes first, then debt, then internal finance, exactly the opposite. Then there is the Miller-Modigliani theorem, which says that the way in which a firm is financed is in principle irrelevant to its value. So that might make you think that this whole discussion has no significance. But here the question that is being asked is not how is value created in the firm, but rather how is value created by the economy, and what is the relation of finance to that process. The Miller-Modigliani theorem describes a world which is organized largely to the benefit of the incumbents and not to the disruptors. So all of the main conceptual devices of the established economics are in some way tilted to the interests and to the perspective of those who are in control of the corporations, their assets, and their plan of production. Now, in order to understand what is interesting, what is troubling, and what is suggestive about this situation, it is useful to fix on three enigmas, which to my mind are the central enigmas of contemporary finance. The first enigma is an enigma of superfluity. The vast preponderance of funds engaged in production are taken from the retained and reinvested earnings of the firms. During the period of high economic growth in the United States between 1950 and 1975, it is calculated that well over 90% of the funding of production was internally generated. Subsequently, it seems to have declined, this percentage seems to have declined modestly. Now, if the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms, what then is the point of all of that money in the banks and in the stock markets? Supposedly, quote, invested. Invested means used for this speculative trading of assets. It seems to describe a world in which the productive potential of the delayed consumption or saving of society is squandered and dissipated in financial speculation. On this view, the problem is not the speculative element in finance. Speculation is useful in generating information and in organizing the allocation of risk. The problem is the dissociation of the speculative element in finance from the agenda of production. Now we come to the second enigma. The second enigma is an enigma of asymmetry in the relation of finance to the real economy. The asymmetry is the following. In good times, finance seems to be largely indifferent to the real economy, but in bad times, it becomes destructive. Financial instability spills over into the real economy and depresses real economic activity. Now, how are we going now, finance is, I think, not the main source of instability in the economy. The main source of instability has to do with the fundamental mechanism of the market economy, which is the relation between supply and demand. This is the fundamental form of instability. You can imagine that this relation is discontinuous and heterogeneous in the following sense. On the supply side, a business, a firm can just wait for more orders until it increases its production. It can increase its inventory in anticipation of future demand. It can innovate and finance innovations that improve efficiency, create more output with fewer inputs. And these innovations, these efficiency increasing innovations, are typically capital sparing. Or it can invest heavily in innovations that create entirely new products, new markets, new desires. It's disruptive innovation. And on the demand side, we can say, we can imagine the expansion of demand on three bases. One is people have assets and use them to spend, to buy things. The second basis is the expansion of credit. Or let's say the second basis is actually the result of compensatory redistribution by the state as a result of progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. And the third basis, then, of purchasing power is the expansion of credit, regardless of actual ownership, of actual control of assets. Now, there's no one-to-one relation between development on the supply side and development on the demand side. The further you go in both these lists that I just enumerated, the more robust, the more vigorous the breakthrough of the supply constraint or of the demand constraint. But it's not because you advance in one of these stages on one side that you automatically advance on the other. There is discontinuity and there is what you could call heteronomy. It's not the same logic that operates on both sides. A breakthrough of a supply constraint on one side can fail to elicit a corresponding breakthrough on the demand side and vice versa. That's the basis, the fundamental basis of instability in the market economy. Keynes's economics, which he called a general theory, was a theory of one particular variant, one species of these failures, of correspondence, of breakthroughs on the demand side to elicit, of course, breakthroughs on the supply side and vice versa. A particular kind of failure that violated Say's law of the failure of supply to create its own demand in the presence of a particular constraint, which was the downward rigidity of the wage that Keynes and his contemporaries emphasized. So rather than being a general theory of slumps, of depressions, it was a theory of one particular form of disequilibrium in the market economy. So let's say that's the fundamental source of instability. The secondary source of instability is finance and its relation to the real economy. Now, English political economy and Keynes, as part of its tradition, emphasized one reason for financial instability and the communication of financial instability to the real economy. The reason was that liquid capital, by virtue of its very liquidity, is uniquely susceptible to bearing the imprint of our humors. Of greed and hope, of fear and despondency, precisely because it's not fixed, because we can easily reallocate it. But a second reason why finance can so easily contribute to instability is that finance does not create its own institutional framework. The institutional framework comes from arrangements and ideas that are external to finance. So let me describe to you the most important example of this institutional instability, of this dependence on institutional presuppositions that come from outside. The most important example was the substitution of the gold standard by Keynesianism itself. If we understand Keynesianism now, not just as a set of ideas, but also practical arrangements and policies. The gold standard made the trading relations between countries depend on the inflows and outflows of gold. So there would be an automatic self-correcting mechanism. The deficit countries would eventually be stopped by what was in effect a crisis in the balance of payments from continuing to trade. The Polish Marxist economist Kalecki observed that the practical significance of the gold standard was to make the level of economic activity depend on the level of business confidence. So if business confidence failed, economic activity would be depressed. Then came Keynesianism and justified the break with the gold standard and the ability of the state to pump up demand. And that then reshaped the political business cycle and redefined the limits of the economic policy of the state, of fiscal and monetary policy. That's an example. Finance did not create this, but it is entirely shaped by the world that's created from outside, the world of economic ideas, of economic policies, of the state of politics. And today we see the same thing in what is, in effect, the only real strategy of economic growth that the United States has. What is the strategy of economic growth of the United States? What has it been since the Second World War? It can basically be summarized in two words: cheap money. And that policy has been implemented not by the national government, but by the central bank, by the Federal Reserve System. That's almost the entirety of the strategy of economic growth of the United States. Finance is then dependent on that world. So then, for these reasons, its dependence on the instability of our humors and its dependence on the institutional arrangements forged in politics and in thought, finance becomes susceptible to these waves of instability. Later on in today's class, I want to discuss a concrete example, which is the run-up to the financial and economic crisis in the United States of 2007, 2008. And this instability that begins in the capital markets then eventually spills over into the real economy and communicates to the real economy. So it wasn't doing anything for production in the good times, but then it becomes destructive at the times of the flood. Now, the third enigma is the enigma of the disconnection between what is most important in finance and what finance mainly does. So the most important social responsibility of finance, we might think, would be to fund the creation of new assets in new ways, to fund innovation. And that's the world of venture capital. Now, 80% of the venture capital activity in the United States, in the world, now takes place in one country, the United States. But in that country, which is vastly preponderant globally in venture capital has a minuscule place and accounts, venture capital in an expanded sense, all the related forms, accounts for less than 0.4% of domestic GDP. So the third enigma is this, that the most important activity, this activity of funding the making of new assets in new ways, accounts for a minuscule part of financial activity. Now, my proposal is that the orthodox view that I described at the outset has no way of making sense of these three enigmas. But we can make sense of them if we take the opposite view, the view that this is the result of a particular way of shaping, of organizing finance and shaping its relation to the real economy, of shaping its relation to production. And it is the way that allows financial hypertrophy to prevail over financial deepening. Now, what would it mean to do the opposite? And to struggle to make deepening prevail over hypertrophy, and to develop the program of both deepening and democratizing finance in its relation to production and to society. So you could say in the short term, you would have to discourage or prohibit financial activity, financial engineering, that has no plausible relation to the expansion of output or the enhancement of productivity. Take a simple example, which I mentioned once before. Options contracts. You know, financial markets, contemporary financial markets, are markets in financial derivatives. That's a legal term. And it's a term which implies the idea, the very idea that I discussed before when expounding the conception of the legal indeterminacy of the market. Property is not a unified power. Property is a bundle of powers. And we can disaggregate it into its component elements. And what are called financial derivatives are markets in some components of the property right. The disaggregation of the property right used for the purpose of redesigning the market order in the particular sphere of the relation of finance to the real economy. Now, options contracts began in commodity markets. And in commodity markets, they perform an undoubted function of increasing liquidity. Then they were taken into equity markets, initially as a device for insurance against gambling, and converted largely into the opposite, into devices of gambling. So now they become part of this casino. And I insist, the problem is not the casino itself. The problem is the relation of the casino to the factory, to production. The problem is the dissociation of the speculative element from production. So because they will prohibit that, and then we could have positive initiatives that would multiply the channels between the vast pools of delayed consumption of saving in the world. For example, the pools of liquid capital caught in the public and private pension systems of the world, and this undone work of venture capital, the financing of the creation of new assets and use. Multiply the channels, create diversified portfolios of investment in innovative enterprise. And of course, the way to control the risk or to pay for the risk is the traditional form of diversification. But that would only be the beginning, because in the long term, this reorganization of finance and of its relation to the real economy would end in something like that thought experiment that I put to you before of the investment funds, of the capitalism without capitalists. You say, oh, we put the productive resources of society in the hands of funds that are organized by the state under a diversified set of regimes, of time horizons, of risk profiles. And these funds conduct a roving, permanent, ongoing auction of the capital resources of society to whichever capital takers are able to assure the funds of the highest rate of return. That's the basic idea, the central idea. Given that the primitive 19th century conception of just decentralizing finance, as in the American initiative of the first half of the 19th century, is clearly not enough in the conditions of a contemporary economy. Decentralization is the primitive form of democratization. I think that the only way to understand these enigmas and to begin to act on them is to see that they're all the expressions of this deeper problem. That radicalizing competition is not enough. That the central issue are the arrangements that shape finance and therefore also shape its relation to the real economy. Now let me stop there and ask for your questions and comments. Yes.
Excuse me?
Yes.
I can't see, so I don't know if you can.
Okay.
So I had a question regarding this pecking order. I'm a bit confused that if the retained earnings have the same cost of
Can you
capital.
speak louder so the people behind you can hear?
So I'm saying that if the retained earnings have the same cost of capital as equity, then why would firms prefer to take retained earnings in place of debt? Because what I understand about theories of finance, they say that you should leverage your firm to a certain extent to be able to give greater return to the shareholder.
The conventional economic explanation of the pecking order is that the preferred forms are forms that impose fewer asymmetries of information on the firms, on the shareholders and the investors, fewer asymmetries of information. And that internal funding is preferred because it doesn't have asymmetries of information, and debt has fewer asymmetries of information than equity. But I think that the explanation is not very convincing, and that the real explanation, this is my counter proposal, is that these are arrangements and practices tailored to the benefits of the incumbents against the challengers. But that's the debate. That's the essence of the debate.
How does it benefit the firm? Because ultimately they have to give returns to the shareholders, and they would want to give higher returns, which would need lower cost of capital so as to be able to give greater profits. So why wouldn't they prefer debt to equity or share?
But what's the doubt? Why do they prefer what?
Why do they prefer retained earnings to debt? Because what I understand is that debt is much cheaper than retained earnings, so far as the cost is concerned to the company or the firm, and they would want
Debt is cheaper than retained earnings?
Yes.
Why?
Because retained earnings are as good as equity capital, and the expected return for the shareholder or the retained earnings is much higher as an entrepreneur. That's the theories of finance which I've studied. I don't know if that's what is the economic theory.
You're nodding your head. Could you help us here?
No, I had a similar question, which is that maybe it's easier with the retained earnings and debt. Basically, my understanding similarly is that you would pick the cheapest forms of capital that you have, and in some cases that means not reinvesting retained earnings and finding whatever cheapest option. It might be debt, it might be equity is a little more complicated because it's a sort of different calculation.
Yes.
But so then the choice is basically it's less about following this pecking order
But what's the alternative use of the retained earnings and to return them to the shareholders?
Well.
Because I think the practical issue is you have these firms that have vast pools of liquid capital. What are they going to do with it? So if they don't invest it in innovation, especially the capital-intensive disruptive innovation, what do they do with it?
They wait. I mean, I think that's a fair question, but like if you think of Apple as an example, a quintessential example of
Yes.
these companies, they just wait until there's a very good use for it sometimes, and that's what they say at least, which is maybe there isn't a case for it today, but there might be. It might be worthwhile to just hold on to that because maybe next year.
Well, that's an explanation for a short-term transitional thing. But if what you have is then just a snowball of more and more liquid capital, it doesn't explain that situation. Yes.
Yeah, I think in that situation, it might be wise, and you see companies such as Apple.
Why? Can you speak louder?
Oh, the mic's not working? I would say in those situations, it might make sense, as Apple does, to buy your own stock back.
Yes.
And things of that nature, again, not making more inroads into the real economy, but I think that makes sense. I think the debt standpoint makes sense, but why would you do that if you had so much retained earnings and you didn't have something that you wanted to invest in?
That's right. So you buy your own state. So that increases even more the advantages of the controlling interest in the corporation. I guess the next step is to take the company private.
Or you could give dividends to the shareholders. You need not buy back the stock. You can pay back the income to the shareholders.
But that's thinking from the standpoint of the owners, right? Now, if we think from the standpoint of society, what is the calculus? That we would think that this phenomenon in which a few corporations have more and more liquid capital, and they don't know what to do with it, and in the end they buy back their own stock or take themselves private, is a pathology. Because this shows that there's a disconnection between capital and its uses. Now, of course, what the venture capitalists would say with respect to this third enigma, right? The disconnection in which the most important activity is the smallest one, is that the problem in venture capital is the paucity of interesting projects. That's what the venture capitalists say. They say, we'd love to have more projects, but we don't have them. And of course, that's then the circular relation, because it's not just the isolated problem of the availability of capital. It's the existence of a productivist project that involves more of society in these disruptive innovations. And you can't separate out the element of capital. So in relation to the arguments here in this course, you have to connect our earlier arguments about the insular knowledge economy versus the inclusive economy to these arguments. We're not going to solve any problem by simply democratizing capital if there's no use for capital. So you have to imagine a process by which the insular knowledge economy extends its dominion, its influence on social life. And as part of that process then, it generates opportunities for disruptive innovation and venture capital. That would be an important part of the reasoning. Yes. Go ahead.
Can you hear me better, or is it the same? Same?
No, just speak
Okay.
loud.
I'll speak loud. I have an observation and a question.
Yes.
The observation is the venture capital model you're describing to me sounds more prone to work in places, countries, jurisdictions where transaction costs are lower. So such as the United States, where you have less informational asymmetries, you have more flow of information, and you have a robust financial regulation system where you can ensure that there is transparency around the investments that you can make. Now I wonder whether that's different in developing countries. I'm thinking of the example of India or South Korea when it developed, where conglomerates have been pretty instrumental in directing capital with less transaction costs. And that, I think, runs counter the intuition that a venture capital distributed model is necessarily better for distributing opportunity than concentration. Because
Better than what?
than a concentrated model, where, for example, in India, conglomerates or in South Korea were instrumental to be able to develop across industries because, chaebols, for example, the South Korean conglomerates were able to redirect finance and, in this case, earnings from industry to industry to fuel that growth. So I wonder whether it's country-specific more than just a model against the other. And that was the consideration, and then the question was pretty much in the similar line. How do you evaluate the state-owned enterprises in this framework? Because this, again, sounds like a very US-based consideration, but the engines of growth in Asia right now, for example, are driven by state-owned enterprises, which is basically public finance. So how do you evaluate that within this framework?
Yes. Well, give me a minute, I'll be right back. I just have to go. Just give me 2 minutes, I'll be right back. So I think that your question and your consideration seem to be completely different. But actually they're not different. They're about the same question. And they're about the question of the relation between innovation and the institutional arrangements of the society. So we might think that the problem with conglomerates is they they constrain radical innovation. They're a form of, they have scale, they have facilities of capital for organizing things, but they're little empires. And empires are bad for heretics. Now, of course, in the theory developed by the business schools, theoretically, there would be a solution for the little industrial empires, which is that they organize separate parts of themselves as the terrains of innovation. So they preserve the main line of production. They don't jeopardize their existing lines of production and services, but they create within themselves a separate branch to work subversively. But that's not quite enough. So then this is an object of debate in comparative industrial studies. When people, for example, compare the South Korea, which is the example you gave, to Taiwan. Taiwan has a less centralized, less authoritarian model in which, rather than devolving power to the conglomerates, it allows a wide range of small enterprises to develop things that are new. And that seems to have been crucial in the development of their semiconductor industry. So that's the question there. Now, then you continue this line of inquiry when you speak about the state, because in all of this conversation that we're having, it seems to me that a central problem is what's the relation between the people who are in immediate control of the productive apparatus, be they private managers or public managers, and the strategic interests of the society. So in principle, the state would be more responsive to the collective interests. But in practice, not necessarily. And we have not developed forms of public administration that are the administrative counterpart to the knowledge economy. It's an experimental form of state organization. Take something very simple. The state, under the way in which it perceives the rule of law, is constrained in its ability to try things out. So the state operates by universal rules, but that's not good enough. When we don't know what the path is and we have to develop the path experimentally or empirically, we have to be able to modify the conception of the rule of law and allow us to try different things out with particular classes of people or in particular places before we generalize it into a predominant solution. And maybe we never will generalize it into a predominant solution. And this problem becomes paramount in the provision of public goods. So all we have in the world now, by way of provision of public goods, is what you could call an administrative Fordism. It's the provision of low-quality, standardized public goods by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. By which I mean simply goods that are of lower quality than the equivalent goods that could be bought on the market by someone who has money. So, and you could say, well, we should reimagine this system. We should not accept administrative Fordism as the only form of provision of public goods. You should say, the state will provide a floor of universal public goods to everyone, standardized universal public goods. The state may also operate at the ceiling in the financing and development of the most complex and costly public goods. But in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state should partner with independent civil society. And independent civil society should be organized in not-for-profit, in cooperatives, for example, of education specialists, health specialists, and partner with the state in the experimentalist provision of public goods. That's the best way to enhance their quality and at the same time the most powerful incitement to the self-organization of civil society outside the state. So that's what we have to do, and we have to do that also in industrial policy. So I think that your question and your comment both highlight this problem of the unsatisfactory relation between the task which I'm presenting or evoking, the task of a form of economic organization that's hospitable to experiment, and the available institutional agents. Because who are these agents? Either they are entrepreneurs who are capable of decentralized initiative and invention and so forth, but are greedy and are out for themselves, or they are bureaucrats who are speaking in the name of the state and the collective interest, but who have all the pathology of bureaucrats. And we don't want that. We don't want that choice. So if they give us that hand of cards, we say, oh no, give me different cards. And we won't want to play the game with those cards. So I think that's the essence of the problem that you're putting. And we can only solve that by innovating on both sides. That is, innovating both in the institutional organization of the market order and in the ways in which the state operates. So we open the state to pluralism, we open the state to competition, we open the state to experimentation. And then we'll see empirically how this reorganized market order relates to this reorganized state. Yes?
I'd like to ask you more about financial hypertrophy versus deepening.
Yes.
If we're going here in the next section, feel free to ignore or punt, but I think we've discussed a lot of the elements of what is troubling about the current financial system. I'd love to hear your expansion on to what you attribute the growing financial hypertrophy and lack of financial deepening. What are the reasons that finance captures more value than it creates?
Well, what are the ultimate reasons, I think, is the question. So I think one way, allow me to go back to my American example of the early 19th century. So I said there was this developmental nationalism, and then there was this selective democratization in agriculture and in finance. And that virtuous dialectic between the developmental nationalism on top and the selective democratization below became progressively weaker in later moments of American history. Now, why did it become weaker? I think it became weaker for essentially two reasons, which I would bring under the headings of the weakness of politics and the weakness of thought. So, weakness of politics is the Americans didn't really organize a democracy under their Constitution. They organized a proto-democratic liberalism, which was designed to inhibit the political transformation of the society and the economic order. And in the realm of thought, the idea that I presented as the linchpin, as the premise of those forms of selective democratization was not an idea that they made explicit. They never said that the agriculture, the family farming system and the radically decentralized finance were examples of the same general idea, which is that the market order has no single natural and necessary form. That idea was only much later in the evolution of legal thought did they then struggle to progress in the idea that a market economy has no natural form. But they didn't present it in the aggressive form, which I just did, as if it were obvious. So in that circumstance, there was a vacuum, and the corporate instrument, the large corporations, married high finance under the watchful eyes of a largely passive state, a state which was rendered passive by the nature of American democracy until the Roosevelt of the New Deal, with all of the defects which we know the New Deal had. So I don't think that there's this, I think that the answer to your question, why does hypertrophy come to prevail over deepening, is not, there's no simple answer to it, because the real answer to it is this large question of the evolution of thought, of ideology on the one hand, and of politics on the other, the nature of politics. That these economic struggles are held in the grip of our ideas and our politics, and that determines the limits. That's what I think. So, but what's the practical result? The practical result is that half of the graduating class of Harvard College goes to work for the banks, for the management consultants. They become paper pushers. No one is producing anything, and this is absurd. This is a tragedy of the squandering of national talent for these predatory, parasitic activities. So now, why does that happen? So that's the real question you have. Why this? And there's no simple answer to it. There's only the answer to it is this complicated answer, in which all the innovations that happen in the world, like the knowledge economy itself, they're subject to this law of the path of least resistance. Right? As I said, the path of least resistance is the form of the innovations that is easiest to reconcile with the ruling interests and preconceptions. And it has a huge advantage, but it's not necessary. So, contrary to what may appear to be the case, the path of least resistance is never the only path. It's the easiest path. But it has a disadvantage which its enemies in thought and in politics can use. Its disadvantage is that it fails to tap more fully the potential of the innovations. Just as an insular knowledge economy fails to create an adequate basis for socially inclusive economic growth. That's the advantage. So, which the enemies are, and so the path of least resistance always has enemies. It always should have enemies, and the enemies have something going for them against the tremendous advantages of the path of least resistance. And the question you ask is about a variant of this issue. Yes.
So I'm one of those like paper pushers. The parasitic have been, will probably continue to be. But I'm just curious if you think there's merit to the idea that like perhaps the path to real production in terms of how we've been thinking about it, like that has been changing very rapidly, such that the way we're looking at the problem might not sort of capture exactly the things we're trying to capture. So, for example, when we say, well, the VC example that VC represents 0.4% of the GDP, like because, or that's not a good example. I have a different example, which is like a very stylized example of production from, say, the turn of the 19th century might be, you have a factory, borrow a bunch of money to buy, some machines, and then they produce things, and the real production is pretty
Yeah.
measurable. And so it's a sort of simple linear relationship there. Versus maybe, some of the largest firms in the market today have a significantly more circuitous path towards the ultimate forms of production that they do produce. And in that path,
I'm not clear. So
Okay,
what's
so
the,
for
what's the nub of the question? What's the core of the question?
For example, maybe like, in fact, I think going back to.
So this is, so
Amon's
it's
question
the-
from earlier with Microsoft as an example of like a company that's sitting on a pile of money that, they should be using. They waited a long time and then made some big acquisition.
Uh-huh.
And, maybe that is this with AI and stuff, maybe that'll actually be a sort of significant big moment of production that's going to spur. And so like, over the course of decades, the connection between finance and production becomes clearer, but not in the.
not in the short term. Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
the other also.
of course,
I wanted to complement, I think.
you were going to add
Super
something?
quick, I was gonna complement, I think what you're trying to say is that source of capital doesn't necessarily equate use of capital. So venture capital, to a large extent, flows into software companies that can also contribute to paper pushing, and if they don't necessarily contribute to the production economy.
I agree. So the question of the source of capital is in a way secondary, or it's accidental. And this debate, which we're rehearsing here, recalls earlier debates in American history. So it's not as if this were not a debate that didn't exist before in the American entrepreneurial classes. In another course I'm discussing this week, the example of Henry Ford, who was one of the American prophets. And Henry Ford, in his time, was admired all over the world. And people were sent from Russia, from Germany, to study Ford and his factories. And Henry Ford took a position that his business was to make cars and not to make money. And there was a contrast between Alfred Chandler in the leadership of General Motors and Henry Ford, who associated himself with what he called producerism, and I would call productivism. But it was a debate, and the company was controlled by the workers down below who managed the assembly line, did routine work. They were relatively unskilled, but there was an elite of machinists and technicians from the Midwest who were, within the world of mass production, the antecedent form of the knowledge economy, nestled in Ford's business. And it was the same, it was an early version of the same thing that we're debating now. What's the relation of the real stuff of making things, of inventing things, to all this, to this money, to these paper profits, and what can be done to affirm the subordination of the paper to the real stuff, and that's what we're struggling with here. And I think they're all iterations of the same fundamental problem. Now, I would like to add two more elements here before the class ends, which are about two somewhat different problems. One is the relation of these issues of finance to globalization. And we're going to be discussing globalization next week. And the second is the lessons of the financial and economic crisis of 2007, 2008, of which the United States, the richest, most developed country in the world, was the epicenter. So the first problem has the context are the developing countries, the major developing countries in the world and their projects, and its relation to globalization. And the context of the second problem are the rich countries, and especially the United States. So there's this idea in the world that globalization is a kind of catch-all alibi for all forms of surrender. So a left-leaning government thinks I would like to do this or I like to do that, but I can't do it because of globalization. But now we see that under the same form of globalization, two different regions of the world responded in radically different ways to the same constraints. So let's contrast now Latin America and Northeast Asia and the way they responded to the same form of globalization. Northeast Asia attempted to control its engagement with the world capital market. So it imposed limits on the free flows of capital, capital controls. It refused to rely on foreign saving as the basis of its early development, and insisted on forced elevation of national saving, both public and private. And it did not allow foreign capital in the early stages of these national projects of development to penetrate the production system, to acquire ownership of the main productive assets. It preferred loan capital to this takeover of the intermediate industries. Latin America was the opposite on all of these points. So in Latin America, they signed on the dotted line as the academic, entrepreneurial, and political authorities of the North recommended the path of orthodoxy, which they themselves had not followed in their national development. The United States didn't do anything of what they recommended the Latin American countries to do. And they told them, do this, and that's what the Latin American countries did. So they accepted this path of reliance on foreign saving, acquiescence in a very low level of domestic saving, opening of the capital account, penetration of the national economy and the ownership of its productive apparatus by foreign capital, especially in the crucial intermediate industries, like the industries that produce consumer durables. And what happens is what always happens in history. In history, rebellion is not always rewarded, but obedience is invariably punished. And so the Latin American countries were the most obedient in the world to the pseudo-orthodoxy that came from the North. I call it pseudo because it was an orthodoxy just for the little people, right? For the latecomers. It wasn't an orthodoxy for them. Yes?
Do you think they acquiesced or it was imposed upon them? Because many regimes...
Well, what do you mean by they always say that the chains were imposed on them, right?
Right, but like Allende was, they supported Pinochet over...
Well, what was the mechanism of the imposition?
Actually, I think it was not just ideological or just trade, but that there were, it was military imposition as well.
No, I think, but that doesn't work. I mean, I think, for example, the most important military dictatorship was in my country, Brazil. And they didn't impose the American ideas. They had a version of right-wing nationalism. They developed state-run, state-controlled industry against these ideas. That's what happened there. Chile was a different story because Chile was a much smaller country without a developed industrial apparatus. That was a different story.
You don't think the IMF imposed...
Of course the IMF had all of its conditionality. But so they created this vulnerability, which then allowed the IMF to take this authoritarian position and to become the mouthpiece of the pseudo-orthodoxy. But they did it. So it wasn't the period of gunboat diplomacy of the late 19th or early 20th century in which the United States would send ships to make the debtors pay. The debtors were, I think, legitimately acting on Oscar Wilde's advice that it is not by paying one's debts that one lives in the memory of the commercial classes. But this was in the mid-20th century, they imposed this on themselves. Now, and why did they do this? This was an idea that they had. They'd sent many were these authoritarian regimes that you mentioned. They were staffed by people who had come to places like MIT and Harvard and and I followed this process. I would see here what would happen. So they would send these smart middle-class kids, not from the economic elite, to get a doctorate in economics at Harvard or at MIT, right? Then the kid would come full of ideas and he would write a doctoral thesis attacking neoclassical economics, attacking the other. And the kid would arrive here and he'd speak with his doctoral advisor. And the doctoral advisor didn't have any idea what he was talking about. So the doctoral advisor was not hostile. The doctoral advisor was totally in the dark because the American economists didn't know the history of economics. They hadn't studied the history. They hadn't read the economics. They didn't know any of this stuff. They couldn't help him. And he, the kid, didn't have any of the intellectual instruments to do what he set out to do. Then he would end up surrendering, right? And he would end up writing a doctoral dissertation applying the same orthodox economic apparatus to some national problem, like the dynamics of the Brazilian hyperinflation or something like that. So this person, this young man or woman, would have an experience of failure. And he would say, well, look, I failed at what I set out to do. I came here to be a thinker. And I'm not going to be a thinker. So then he would say, well, at least I'm not going to be poor, right? I'm going to go back to my country, and I'm going to find a way to become rich. Now, Rousseau wrote, they couldn't become men, so they decided to become rich. And this is exactly what happened. So so he would go, this kid would go back and say, he would work in the central bank. Because in our country, you know, in most countries, the central bankers are people with a brilliant past. In Brazil, there are people with a brilliant future. So he would go work in the central bank. And from the central bank, he would then transition into the banks, into the investment banks, in this role of intermediating international capital with national finance, and he would become rich. And this was the national project, the national drama of submission, which I just described in national terms, was translated into this existential drama, which you could see before you of these individuals, collapsing, surrendering, enriching themselves. It was very clear. That's what happened. And this was, and I can't understand that anyone imposed this on them. This was the country that delivered itself in trains to this orthodoxy, to this pseudo-orthodoxy. Well, so much for this. So this prefigures a debate about globalization in the sense that there is one form of globalization. It does have a definite contours. It does impose definite restraints, but those restraints have within them a certain room for maneuver, as the contrast of the differing responses of Northeast Asia and Latin America to the same constraints illustrates. It was the same world that they were dealing with, and they operated in that world in a way which either increased or diminished the space for the exercise of national sovereignty. Now let's come to the question of the revealing financial and economic crisis of 2007, 2008, centered in the United States and then spreading through much of the world, especially the rich world. What was the nub of this crisis? What was the center of it? How do you explain it in its fundamental sense? I would say the nub was this. After the Second World War, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal began in an early phase of institutional experimentation, which was mainly focused not on the democratization of the American economy or of economic opportunity in the United States. It was focused on the corporatist restabilization of the economy and the use of the government as an employer of last resort. So it's corporatism and public employment, mimicking very, very closely the same policies that were used by the right-wing fascist and Nazi regimes in their early years. There's no substantial difference, contrary to what the Americans would like to believe or think, between the early experimentalism of the New Deal and it wasn't because Roosevelt wasn't sincere. He was sincere. He was a radical experimentalist. He kept saying, I'll try everything. He was willing to listen to anyone. But the problem is the relative inelasticity of institutional ideas at any given time. The politicians think their only problem is the practical opposition to their ideas. But their more fundamental problem is with the ideas, and they're not being there. So they said, it's like Shakespeare said, you can call the spirits, but will they come? And the answer is, in general, they don't come when you call them. So that was the early New Deal, with its corporatist restabilization, its employment of unemployed labor by the government. Then there was a second period in which the focus narrowed to the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity, of which the most salient example was Social Security. Then there was the remarkable episode of the war economy, in which everything was different, right? In 3 years or 4 years, GDP in the United States doubled, more than doubled. And the economy was run on completely different principles from the principles to which the Americans were supposedly devoted. So it's as if they were wearing a mask, and when necessity knocked at the door, they cast off the mask, and they did things completely different, with sensational results. Because there had never been, in the whole world, such a remarkable episode of forced economic growth. And then the fourth period, at the end of the war and afterwards, Roosevelt's already dead, mass consumption, right? And it was already prefigured during Roosevelt's life. They asked Roosevelt, what book would you like most like every Soviet child to read? Thinking he would answer the Holy Bible, but he answered the Sears Roebuck catalog. And the idea was economic growth based on mass consumption. Now, what was the nub of the problem after the war? The United States entered a period of increasing inequality, rapid accentuation of inequality. How can you reconcile inequality in the distribution of wealth and income with a strategy of economic growth based on mass consumption? The Americans did it by the democratization of credit. So instead of a property-owning democracy, theorized by their philosophers, a kind of fake credit democracy, made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. And in the following context, internally and externally. Internally, the residual strategy of economic growth, which was, as I said before, was cheap money. That was the center of the strategy of economic growth. Cheap money to the end of mass consumption as the driver of economic growth. And in the world economy, by the use of the structural imbalances in the world economy, in which the main motor of growth in the world was the asymmetrical relationship between the Chinese economy and the American economy. So the Americans depended on credit for their growth. And to finance it, in addition to this internal policy of cheap money, they imported the Chinese trade and capital surpluses. Massive import from China of the Chinese trade and capital surpluses. And China needed to reorient its strategy of economic growth from export orientation to deepening of the internal market. Not because deepening of the internal market and mass consumption would be an alternative to export, but it would complement export. But there's a problem in this, in China. The problem is that the deepening of the internal market in China to be carried out would require massive redistribution among classes, among sectors, and among regions in China. And massive redistribution is by its very nature conflictual and threatens then the political control of the country by the party. So the easier path was to evade the imperative of structural change, and to evade it by appealing to the path of least resistance. For the Americans, it was this cheap money, credit, debt-based program. And for the Chinese, it was persisting in their export orientation to the detriment of reliance on the internal market. So each of these two great countries used the structural imbalances in the world economy as a way of evading the imperative of structural change. And then the discourse about the response to the economic crisis was dominated by two themes: re-regulation, regulation or re-regulation of finance, and stimulus for recovery. Now, take each of those themes. So, re-regulation of finance. The regulation of finance in the United States in the second half of the 20th century was heavily dependent on what you could call the strategy of regulatory dualism. That is, it assumed the need or the legitimacy of a contrast between two sectors, a thickly regulated sector where the financial institutions used federally insured deposits as part of their repertoire, and a thinly regulated sector supposedly populated by financial professionals and high net worth individuals. So what happened as part of the run-up to the crisis of 2007, 2008 was that all of the chancy financial products and services prohibited in the thickly regulated sector were relabeled and repackaged in the thinly regulated sector. And that was a crucial part of the background to the crisis. Then the Americans gave a regulatory response to the crisis with 4 sets of regulatory initiatives. First was a partial reaffirmation of the New Deal division between banks that did proprietary trading and banks that depended on federally deposited insurance, federally insured deposits. Glass-Steagall. The second was a new technocratic agenda that increased the power of the Treasury, of the federal government, to liquidate or restructure banks that were big, had structural importance, so-called too big to fail, and they increased these powers of liquidation and restructuring in the federal government. Technocratic program. The third project was the project of the international financial elite, headquartered in Basel in the Bank of International Settlements, to increase the capital adequacy requirements for the banks. And the fourth project was the Consumer Protection Project. Now here's what's interesting. What's interesting is that if you sum up these 4 projects, none of them, nor all of them together, bore on the crucial question of the relation between financial deepening and financial hypertrophy. It's as if they were completely marginal. And in fact, the underlying strategy of regulatory dualism that I described was never swept aside to this day. So it continues to be in place as the basis of the system. It's a completely inadequate response, and what you could say is a squandering of the transformative potential of the crisis. Then the second response was stimulus. Now, stimulus, and by the way, before I turn to stimulus, so the basic conceptual idea is that there is, in principle, there's no rigid distinction between regulation and reorganization. Once you allow the idea that a market economy has no single natural and necessary form, then the next step is to admit that every way of regulating the market is the first step of a way of reorganizing it. There's no clear contrast between regulation and reorganization. These particular regulatory strategies which they adopted were all institutionally conservative. But it's not because it was regulation. It was because it was a particular kind of regulation which was evasive of the imperative of structural change. Now we come to the stimulus. So the generic problem with any stimulus in facing a crisis is that for the stimulus to be consequential, it has to have a large dimension if the crisis is a big crisis. And like the crisis brought by the Depression of the 1930s was. And long before it reaches this requisite dimension to deal with a crisis, it will begin to disorganize the incentives and arrangements of the established economy and to exact an unacceptable cost and lost output. That's the basic problem with the stimulus. Now, given this limitation, which inherently constrains the magnitude of the stimulus, even with the cheap money policy as part of the background, the question is, what's the relation of the stimulus to a structural program? And here the crucial idea is that a stimulus in principle could be used as a way of prefiguring the structural program. The United States was in the early stages of the development of the insular knowledge economy. And it could have taken initiatives by way of stimulus to anticipate some of the things that would have been required for the development of a more inclusive knowledge economy. But in fact, the stimulus was used to compensate the banks, not the mortgage holders, not the workers, not the entrepreneurs in the startup enterprise. So the stimulus did not prefigure this alternative structural program. So on the side of regulation, which is not inherently distinguished from reorganization, no change of the fundamental relation of finance to production. And on the side of stimulus, no prefigurement of the productivist project for the future. An entirely self-imposed diminishment of the American people by their democracy. So that's what I wanted to say about the crisis. So the two stories that I told, one about the developing countries and globalization, and the other about the crisis and its background, are really variations on the same theme. Which is, each country has to emancipate itself. And emancipation goes to politics and goes to thought. Now we still have a couple of moments for any comments or questions you have about the story of the crisis. This is a sobering moment in American history because it was a great event. And by the way, throughout the world, in Western Europe too, people thought, well, this is the moment in which the left will come to life. But the next thing that happened in politics in the North Atlantic world was that the right appeared on the scene, not the left. And the left had no response to this opportunity. No analysis, no program. Comments? Yes.
So I'm curious to know that though China wasn't, as you said, wasn't able to reorient towards its internal side and deepening its financial market or economy, that relationship.
I didn't say it wasn't able to. I said it didn't want to.
Didn't want to.
No.
Okay, so you feel that it did to some extent, and therefore, compared to the other Asian countries, as well as the other countries, because of its distinct difference in which it responded to the way U.S. had a hold over the understanding and ideas, it is still a big manufacturing place, and its manufacturing potential overrides the rest of the countries in that region and most part of the world. So what could be the reason for that?
Well, I have to come back to the same thing, thought and politics. So, so the Chinese leadership now is terrified of Gorbachev. They don't want to be Gorbachev, right? they've ended up with Brezhnev. So that's the first thing. And that there's no alternative to struggle in politics. An alternative might have been represented by Bolshevik. He was crushed, he was purged. These are the internal struggles. But then there's thought. So you go to they have an institution in China of the Central Party School, which forms the cadres of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. I spent a week there. I was totally shocked in the discussions I had with them. So the only person there who referred to Marxism was me. And the texts that they described, that they were discussing, were the texts of third and fourth rate American academics, policy discourse. That's what they were discussing there. And they have, so what can you expect of a country which is terrified in political struggle